Paris, August 21st, 1911, 7:15 in the morning. A small man in a white worker's smock walked through the exit door of the Louvre Museum carrying something wrapped in cloth under his arm. The door had been locked moments earlier, which should have stopped him cold, but a plumber working nearby thought the man was a museum employee and unlocked it for him without question. The small man nodded his thanks and disappeared into the empty Paris streets. What he carried under his arm would trigger the greatest art manhunt in history and briefly transform a 29-year-old Spanish painter named Pablo Picasso into a prime suspect in the theft of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. 24 hours would pass before anyone realized that the painting was missing. 2 years would pass before investigators found it. Between the theft and the recovery, the investigation would expose stolen artifacts hidden in Picasso's wardrobe, a midnight attempt to throw evidence into the Seine River, and a courtroom confrontation where Picasso would deny even knowing his best friend. The theft of the Mona Lisa wasn't just a crime. It was the moment a moderately admired Renaissance portrait became the most famous painting in human history. Tuesday morning, August 22nd, 1811. French painter Louis Béraud arrived early at the Louvre, eager to begin his day's work. Béraud had received permission to paint a copy of one of the museum's galleries, and he set up his easel in the Salon Carré, the gallery of Renaissance treasures where some of the museum's finest works hung. He arranged his paints and brushes, adjusted his canvas, and then looked up at the wall to begin studying the paintings he would capture. Something was wrong. Between Antonio de Correggio's mystical marriage and Titian's allegory hung 4 iron pegs, nothing else. The small wooden portrait that should have been hanging there had vanished. Béraud wasn't immediately concerned. The Louvre had recently installed a photography studio on the roof, and paintings were routinely taken upstairs to be photographed since cameras in 1911 didn't work well inside the dimly lit galleries. He called over a guard and asked when the photographers would be finished with the missing painting. The guard promised to check. He climbed the stairs to the roof studio. The photographers didn't have the painting. The guard hurried back down and began searching the conservation departments. The painting wasn't there either. By mid-morning, the truth became unavoidable. Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa had been stolen. The Louvre closed its doors immediately. Museum director Théophile Homollet, who had publicly declared just months earlier that stealing from the Louvre was impossible, was vacationing in the south of France when the news reached him. According to newspaper accounts from the time, he initially refused to believe the reports. Police investigators flooded into the building. 60 detectives began searching the Louvre's 1,000 rooms. They found the painting's protective glass case and heavy Renaissance-era frame in a service stairwell near the Salon Carré. The thief had removed the artwork from its casing and abandoned the frame, which weighed nearly 200 pounds with the glass attached. The discovery of the frame told investigators everything and nothing simultaneously. The thief knew exactly what he was doing. He had the skill to quickly remove the painting from its protective housing. He had the strength to carry the frame to the stairwell. He had the knowledge of the museum's layout to find a service stairway where he could work unobserved. What investigators couldn't understand was how he had gotten the painting out of the building. The Louvre employed only around 150 security personnel to guard 250,000 artifacts spread across acres of galleries. The Mona Lisa itself hadn't even been bolted to the wall. It simply hung from 4 iron pegs. A fingerprint was lifted from the protective glass. Police photographed it and began the painstaking process of comparing it to their files. The French government sealed the country's borders. Every vehicle attempting to cross from France into neighboring countries faced inspection. Ships in French ports were searched. Newspapers across Paris, across France, across Europe and America printed front-page stories about the missing masterpiece. Rewards were offered. The Society of Friends of the Louvre pledged 25,000 francs for information leading to the painting's recovery. The magazine L'Illustration promised 40,000 francs. The newspaper Le Matin added 5,000 francs to the pool. Here's the critical detail that most people today don't understand. In 1911, the Mona Lisa wasn't yet the world's most famous painting. Art historians and elite collectors admired Leonardo da Vinci's work. The portrait had hung in the Louvre since 1797 and had been part of the French royal collection before that. But the average person in Paris, London, or New York had never heard of it. The theft itself would change that forever. The Louvre reopened to the public 9 days after the theft. Thousands of people flooded through the doors. They didn't come to see the museum's other masterpieces. They came to stare at the empty space where the Mona Lisa had hung. The blank wall became more popular than the painting had ever been. Investigators pursued hundreds of leads. Tips flooded in from across Europe. According to police records, amateur detectives, self-proclaimed psychics, and clairvoyants all contacted authorities claiming they could locate the painting through supernatural means. Every lead went nowhere. The trail had gone cold almost immediately. Under intense public pressure to show progress, investigators began casting a wider net for suspects. One early focus of the investigation landed on members of Paris's avant-garde art community. Among them was Guillaume Apollinaire, a Polish-Italian poet and art critic who had once publicly suggested that the Louvre should be burned down. Apollinaire was well known in Parisian artistic circles. He was also best friends with a young Spanish painter who had recently moved to Paris and was beginning to make a name for himself. That painter was Pablo Picasso. Before we find out why Picasso became a suspect in the greatest art theft of the 20th century, I want to let you know that this channel brings you the most compelling true crime stories from American and world history every single week. Real cases, genuine investigations, and the shocking truths behind crimes that shaped our world. If you are fascinated by unsolved mysteries, daring heists, and the darkest chapters of history that most people never learn about, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, what happens next in this case involves midnight escapes, courtroom betrayals, and a twist ending that transformed art history forever. Oh, and real quick, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below with your city and country. It's always amazing to see how far these true crime stories reach. Are you listening from Paris, New York, Tokyo, Sydney? Let me know. Now, back to Paris in 1911, where police investigators were about to discover that Pablo Picasso had stolen Louvre artifacts hidden in his apartment. To understand why Picasso became a suspect, you need to understand his world in 1911. The Spanish painter had moved to Paris in 1904 at age 23. He settled in Montmartre, the bohemian neighborhood on Paris's northern hills, where artists, poets, and writers congregated in a ramshackle building called the Bateau Lavoir. The name meant laundry boat because the structure supposedly swayed in the wind and looked like the floating laundries on the Seine. Picasso lived and worked there among a tight-knit community of creative misfits who would later be known as La Bande de Picasso, Picasso's gang. Among his closest friends was Guillaume Apollinaire. Apollinaire and Picasso bonded over their shared status as foreigners in Paris. Apollinaire had been born in Rome to a Polish mother and moved to Paris as a young man. Picasso had arrived from Spain, speaking broken French. Both men were outsiders trying to revolutionize art in a city that didn't quite know what to make of them. By 1907, Picasso had begun developing the style that would eventually be called Cubism, though he hadn't yet fully broken through to mainstream recognition. He was talented, ambitious, and perpetually broke. That year, 1907, Picasso visited the Louvre with Apollinaire and told him about 3 ancient Iberian sculptures on display that fascinated him. The statues dated back to the 3rd or 4th century BCE and had been discovered in Spain. Picasso loved their rough-hewn, primitive features. The simplified faces and geometric forms spoke to something he was trying to achieve in his own work. According to later testimony and memoirs from people who knew them, Picasso mentioned to Apollinaire and Apollinaire's secretary, a Belgian man named Honoré-Joseph Géripierre, how much he wished he could study those statues more closely. Géripierre decided to make that wish come true. He stole the sculptures from a Louvre storage facility in the museum's basement. How he accomplished this remained somewhat mysterious, even after he later boasted about it. Pierret claimed he simply tucked all 3 statues under his trench coat and walked out. The statues were quite large and heavy, which made his story implausible. He likely made multiple trips or had help. What wasn't in question was what happened next. 2 of the stolen Iberian statues ended up in Picasso's apartment on Montmartre. The Spanish painter paid Pierret 50 francs for each one. Picasso kept the stolen artifacts hidden in his wardrobe. His lover at the time, Fernande Olivier, later wrote in her memoir that Pierret had told them the pieces should not be displayed too conspicuously, but hadn't revealed exactly where he'd obtained them. Picasso treasured the sculptures. He studied their forms obsessively. In 1907, he completed what would become recognized as the first masterpiece of modern art. The painting was called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and it depicted 5 female figures rendered in angular, fractured forms that broke completely from traditional representation. 2 of the faces in that revolutionary painting were directly modeled on the stolen Iberian statues hidden in Picasso's wardrobe. The foundation of modern art was literally built on stolen property. Géry Pierret didn't stop with those 2 statues. By 1911, he had made multiple trips to the Louvre to steal small objects from display cases and storage areas. The museum's security was so lax that he apparently did this compulsively, treating the Louvre like his personal shopping center. In May of 1911, just months before the Mona Lisa disappeared, Pierret stole another Iberian sculpture and placed it on Apollinaire's mantelpiece as a gift. The poet accepted it without asking too many questions. Then, the Mona Lisa vanished, and everything changed. The massive investigation that followed put pressure on everyone connected to the Louvre, including people who had stolen from the museum in the past. Géry Pierret, broke and desperate for money, saw an opportunity. Newspapers were offering substantial rewards for information about the theft. Even if Pierret didn't know who stole the Mona Lisa, he could profit from his own crimes. On August 29th, 1 week after the theft, he walked into the offices of the Paris Journal newspaper and made a confession. Pierret told the newspaper that he had been stealing from the Louvre for years. He claimed the museum's security was pathetically inadequate. To prove his point, he offered to return one of the stolen pieces. The newspaper published his confession, though they agreed to keep his identity anonymous. Pierret's letter to the Paris Journal described how easy it had been to steal multiple Iberian pieces on consecutive visits. He mentioned that he had sold some of these stolen artifacts to friends in Paris, including a painter who had a particular interest in Iberian art. Police investigators read the Paris Journal story with great interest. They began investigating Géry Pierret's background. They discovered that he had worked as secretary to Guillaume Apollinaire. They knew that Apollinaire was Pablo Picasso's closest friend. They knew both men were foreigners living in Paris. They knew Apollinaire had once called for the Louvre to be burned to the ground. These facts, combined with Pierret's admission that he'd sold stolen Louvre artifacts to a painter interested in Iberian art, made Apollinaire and Picasso look extremely suspicious. The logic was simple if you were a detective under enormous pressure to solve the century's most embarrassing art crime. If these men were willing to buy and possess stolen Louvre property, perhaps they were capable of orchestrating something bigger. Early September 1911. Picasso and Apollinaire read the newspaper accounts of Pierret's confession with growing horror. Both men realized they were in serious danger. Apollinaire had a stolen Iberian sculpture sitting on his mantelpiece. Picasso had 2 more hidden in his wardrobe, both stamped on the bottom with the words "Property of the Musée du Louvre." If police came searching, the evidence would damn them both. Picasso faced an additional terror that Apollinaire didn't have to contend with. As a Spanish citizen, Picasso could be deported from France. All his work building a career in Paris could be destroyed in an instant. On the night of September 5th, Picasso and Apollinaire made a desperate decision. They packed the 3 stolen Iberian statues into an oversized suitcase and left their studio near midnight. According to later accounts from both men, they were in a state of panic. They didn't dare hire a carriage because that would mean involving another person who might remember them. They carried the heavy suitcase through the dark cobblestone streets of Montmartre, struggling with the weight. Their destination was the Seine River. Their plan was simple: throw the evidence into the water and let the river carry their crime away and see. The walk took them through Montmartre's steep slopes down toward the river. Gas lamps still illuminated some of the streets in 1911 Paris, and the two men had to move carefully to avoid being too visible. They finally reached the banks of the Seine. The dark water gleamed under the sparse lighting. This was the moment. All they had to do was heave the suitcase over the embankment and watch it sink. Their secret would be safe. Neither man could do it. According to their later confessions, they stood there for an extended period staring at the river. Picasso loved those statues. They had inspired what he knew was his greatest work. Apollinaire, despite his avant-garde provocations, couldn't bring himself to destroy ancient artifacts. The two men stood in silence. Then they picked up the suitcase and trudged the 3 miles back to their studio, defeated and terrified. By morning, they had formulated a new plan. Apollinaire would take the statues to the Paris Journal, the same newspaper that had published Pierret's confession. The newspaper had agreed to return the piece Pierret had offered. Perhaps they would take these additional items as well, and no one would need to know where they came from. Apollinaire put on what was later described as a very silly disguise and delivered the statues to the newspaper's offices. The editors agreed to anonymity. They took the sculptures and prepared to return them to the Louvre. But it was already too late. The Paris Journal couldn't resist pushing the story further. Editors pressured their source for more details. Police investigators, meanwhile, had been digging into Géry Pierret's background and had connected him definitively to Apollinaire. On September 7th, 1911, police arrested Guillaume Apollinaire on suspicion of harboring an art thief and potentially being involved in the theft of the Mona Lisa. Apollinaire spent several days in jail. Under interrogation, he confessed to possessing the stolen Iberian sculpture. He explained about Pierret. He gave up Picasso's name and admitted that the Spanish painter also possessed stolen Louvre property. Within days, authorities ordered Picasso to appear before a magistrate for questioning. The courtroom confrontation that followed became legendary in art world history. According to multiple accounts, including Picasso's own later recollections, the Spanish painter was absolutely terrified. He walked into the courtroom where Apollinaire was already being held. The magistrate asked Picasso directly if he knew the man standing before him. Picasso, betrayed, panicking about the possibility of deportation, weeping openly, looked at his best friend and lied. He claimed he had never seen Guillaume Apollinaire before in his life. Years later, in a conversation with writer Gilbert Proutot, Picasso admitted what happened next. He described seeing Apollinaire's expression change in that moment of betrayal. The blood drained from Apollinaire's face. The poet realized that his closest friend was denying their entire relationship to save himself. The two men stood there, connected by years of friendship and creativity, and Picasso denied it all. The magistrate handling the case was Judge Henri Driot. Despite the evidence of the stolen statues, Driot didn't believe either man had anything to do with the Mona Lisa theft. Their emotional, theatrical testimonies convinced him they were guilty only of possessing stolen artifacts, not of orchestrating the century's greatest art heist. Apollinaire had confessed to everything. He admitted harboring Pierret, possessing stolen art, and conspiring to hide evidence when they attempted to throw the statues in the Seine. Picasso's hysterical denials and subsequent emotional breakdown suggested fear rather than guilt of the larger crime. Judge Driot dismissed the charges related to the Mona Lisa with a warning. The stolen Iberian sculptures were returned to the Louvre. Picasso and Apollinaire were free to go. The damage to their friendship took time to heal. Apollinaire eventually forgave Picasso for the courtroom betrayal, understanding that terror had driven his friend's actions. But the moment marked both men permanently. Picasso later said he had acted out of pure panic and regretted it for the rest of his life. The statues that had inspired Les Demoiselles d'Avignon went back to the Louvre's collection, where they remain today. The charges were dropped. The public moved on to other theories about who stole the Mona Lisa. Meanwhile, the actual thief had been interviewed twice by police and never seriously suspected. He had continued going about his daily life in Paris while the investigation swirled around him. He kept the stolen painting hidden in his modest apartment, which was located just a few blocks from the Louvre. Every evening, according to his later confession, he would open the trunk where he kept the painting and stare at Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece. He believed the painting had cast a spell on him. He told investigators after his eventual arrest that he had fallen in love with her. The months stretched into years. By the time Picasso and Apollinaire had been cleared and released, the investigation had generated hundreds of false leads. Detectives had pursued theories involving international art theft rings. Some believed American millionaires had commissioned the theft to add the Mona Lisa to their private collections. Others suspected Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany had ordered the painting stolen as a political provocation. One theory suggested that the theft was the work of Arsène Lupin, the fictional gentleman thief from popular French novels. Police took that theory seriously enough to investigate whether the real-life author might have orchestrated a crime based on his own character. More than 100,000 people visited the Louvre in the months following the theft specifically to see the empty space on the wall where the Mona Lisa had hung. The blank spot between Correggio's mystical marriage and Titian's allegory became more famous than the painting itself had been. Postcards were printed showing the vacant wall. Songs were written about the missing lady with the enigmatic smile. The theft had transformed the Mona Lisa from a respected Renaissance portrait into a cultural obsession. Museum director Théophile Homol was forced to resign in disgrace. The man who had declared the Louvre impregnable had been proven spectacularly wrong. Security measures were dramatically increased. Every painting was catalogued. Guards were added. New protocols were established for tracking artwork movements within the museum. But none of these measures helped find the painting. The Mona Lisa had simply vanished. 2 years passed. The thief who had walked out of the Louvre that August morning kept the painting hidden in a wooden trunk with a false bottom beneath his bed. He lived alone in his small apartment. He worked occasional jobs as a painter and handyman around Paris. At night, he would pull out the trunk, lift the false bottom, and study the face that Leonardo da Vinci had painted more than 4 centuries earlier. Lisa Gherardini's serene expression looked back at him from the small wooden panel. The painting measured just 21 inches by 30 inches. It was remarkably easy to hide. The thief's name was Vincenzo Perugia. He had been born in Dumenza, a small village in northern Italy near the Swiss border, in October of 1881. That made him 29 years old when he stole the Mona Lisa, the same age as Picasso, when the Spanish painter briefly became a suspect. Perugia stood only 5 feet 3 inches tall. He had moved to Paris in 1908, hoping to make a living as an artist. When his own paintings failed to sell, he took work as a handyman and decorator. In 1910, he got a job with a company that had been subcontracted by the Louvre to install protective glass cases on valuable paintings. This job gave Perugia intimate knowledge of the museum's layout and security procedures. More importantly, it gave him hands-on experience with the Mona Lisa's protective case. According to museum records and later court testimony, Perugia had actually helped construct the wooden frame and glass housing that protected Leonardo's painting. He knew exactly how the case was mounted to the wall. He knew how to remove the painting from its housing. He understood that it would take him only a few minutes to lift the entire apparatus off its 4 iron pegs and carry it to a location where he could work undisturbed. Perugia's motive for stealing the painting mixed patriotic delusion with criminal opportunism. He believed incorrectly that Napoleon Bonaparte had stolen the Mona Lisa from Italy during his military campaigns in the early 1800s. Perugia saw himself as a patriot who would return stolen Italian property to its homeland. He imagined being hailed as a national hero when he triumphantly restored Leonardo's masterpiece to Italy. The problem with this narrative was that it was based on completely false history. Napoleon did loot countless artworks from Italy during his campaigns, but the Mona Lisa wasn't among them. Leonardo da Vinci had brought the painting to France himself in 1516 when he accepted an invitation from King Francis I. The French king later purchased the painting legally from Leonardo's estate after the artist's death in 1519. The Mona Lisa had been French property for nearly 4 centuries, but Perugia either didn't know this history or chose to ignore it. His plan was straightforward. He would hide in the Louvre overnight, steal the painting when the museum was closed and nearly empty, and keep it hidden until the investigation cooled down. Then he would take it to Italy and find a museum or art dealer who would help him return it to his homeland. He assumed he would be rewarded handsomely for his patriotic act. On Sunday evening, August 20th, 1911, Perugia entered the Louvre dressed in a white smock, identical to those worn by museum workers. He had actually worked at the Louvre until recently, so guards who saw him assumed he was an employee. The museum closed to the public on Sundays for maintenance and cleaning. Perugia knew the building would be largely empty. He made his way to a supply closet and hid there overnight. The closet was cramped and uncomfortable, but Perugia waited patiently through the night hours. Monday morning, August 21st, around 7 in the morning. The Louvre was closed to the public on Mondays during the summer. Only essential maintenance staff were in the building. Perugia emerged from the supply closet. He walked through the nearly empty galleries until he reached the Salon Carré. The room was deserted. He approached the wall where the Mona Lisa hung between 2 other Renaissance masterworks. He lifted the painting, frame and all, off its 4 iron pegs. The complete apparatus weighed close to 200 pounds. Perugia carried it down a service staircase to a landing where he could work without being observed. There, on the staircase landing, Perugia removed the protective glass case. He used tools he had brought with him to dismantle the heavy wooden frame. The painting itself, executed on a poplar wood panel, was relatively small and light, once freed from its protective housing. Perugia left the glass and frame behind on the landing, hidden behind some stored student artworks. He took off his white smock and wrapped the painting in it. Then he tucked the wrapped panel under his arm and headed for the exit. He encountered one final obstacle. The exit door he reached was locked from the inside. This was normal procedure. Workers were regularly being locked inside the Louvre, accidentally because of the building's complex layout and multiple locking doors. Perugia stood there, holding Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece under his arm, trapped inside the museum he had just robbed. Then footsteps approached. A plumber working in the building that morning came around the corner and saw Perugia standing at the locked door. The plumber assumed the man in the worker's smock was a fellow employee who had gotten locked in. He unlocked the door without hesitation. Perugia thanked him and walked out into the Paris morning. He carried the Mona Lisa through the streets to his apartment. He placed the painting in a wooden trunk that had a false bottom. The panel fit perfectly in the hidden compartment. Perugia pushed the trunk under his bed. The greatest art theft in history was complete, and it had taken less than an hour from the moment Perugia emerged from the supply closet to the moment he walked out of the museum. The fingerprint that police had lifted from the protective glass came from Perugia's thumb. His fingerprints were on file with Paris police because he had been arrested years earlier for a minor crime. His photograph was in their files. Police records showed he had worked at the Louvre and had helped install the Mona Lisa's protective case. He had everything needed to execute exactly this kind of theft. But when investigators created a list of all Louvre employees to interview and cross-reference their fingerprints against police files, someone made a critical error. Perugia's name wasn't added to the list. When detectives did eventually interview him twice as part of their broader questioning of former workers, they didn't consider him a serious suspect. He was too small, too unimportant, too obviously incapable of masterminding such a significant crime. So Perugia continued living his quiet life in Paris with the world's most wanted painting hidden under his bed. He told police later that he would open the trunk every evening and gaze at the Mona Lisa. He claimed the painting had cast a spell over him. He described falling in love with her, becoming obsessed with her enigmatic half-smile. For more than 2 years, from August of 1911 to December 1913, Vincenzo Perugia was the only person on Earth who could look at Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece. The painting that spent 2 years hidden in a Paris apartment just blocks from the Louvre had been intended as a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a wealthy Florentine silk merchant. Leonardo began working on it around 1503 or 1504. He apparently never considered it finished, continuing to refine details for years. When he moved to France in 1516 at the invitation of King Francis I, he brought the Mona Lisa with him. The painting remained in France after Leonardo's death. The French royal family kept it in various palaces for centuries before it entered the Louvre's collection. Before the theft, art historians admired the Mona Lisa as an excellent example of Leonardo's technique. The painting demonstrated his mastery of sfumato, the technique of blending colors without sharp lines to create soft, almost atmospheric transitions. Lisa Gherardini's face seemed to emerge from shadow. Her famous enigmatic expression shifted depending on where the viewer stood. The painting was considered significant, but not necessarily more important than dozens of other Renaissance masterworks in the Louvre's collection. The theft changed everything. For 2 years, newspapers across Europe and America ran regular updates on the missing painting. Every false lead generated headlines. The international coverage meant millions of people who had never heard of the Mona Lisa before August 1911 now knew exactly what the painting looked like. Reproductions appeared in publications worldwide. The painting's fame grew exponentially, not despite being stolen, but because of it. I have to pause here and ask you something. If you were in Vincenzo Perugia's position, knowing that returning the painting would likely result in your arrest, but continuing to hide it meant depriving the world of a masterpiece, what would you have done? The Italian handyman claimed he acted from patriotic motives, believing he was returning stolen property to Italy. But his plan also involved selling the painting for 500,000 lire. Meanwhile, his theft had destroyed careers, damaged reputations, and caused international chaos. Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious how you'd navigate that impossible situation, because what Perugia decided to do in late 1913 would determine whether the Mona Lisa would ever be seen again. Here's what happened. By November of 1913, Perugia's patience had finally run out. He had kept the painting hidden for more than 2 years. The intense investigation had cooled. Police had moved on to other cases. Perugia decided it was time to complete his patriotic mission. He carefully packed the Mona Lisa in his wooden trunk and bought a train ticket from Paris to Florence. He crossed into Italy without incident. Customs officials never checked his luggage. In Florence, he checked into a small hotel room under a false name. He called himself Leonardo Vincenzo, which combined the painter's first name with his own first name. Subtle it was not. On November 29, 1913, an antiques dealer in Florence named Alfredo Geri received an unusual letter. The letter was postmarked from Paris, but had been written by someone signing themselves as Leonardo Vincenzo. The writer claimed to possess a famous Italian treasure that had been stolen by Napoleon and taken to France. He wanted to return this treasure to Italy. He asked for a modest reward of 500,000 lire for his patriotic service. Geri was immediately suspicious. He had heard countless stories about the missing Mona Lisa over the past 2 years. Various con artists had tried to sell fake versions of the painting to unsuspecting collectors, but something about this letter intrigued him. The writer seemed sincere, if somewhat delusional, about Napoleon. Geri wrote back agreeing to meet. He also contacted Giovanni Poggi, the director of Florence's Uffizi Gallery, and asked him to attend the meeting. If this turned out to be the real Mona Lisa, they would need an expert to authenticate it. The meeting took place at a hotel in Florence in early December. Vincenzo Perugia, calling himself Leonardo Vincenzo, met with Geri and Poggi in his room. According to their later testimony, Perugia seemed nervous but earnest. He explained that he wanted to return the Mona Lisa to its rightful home in Italy. He believed he was performing a patriotic duty. He pulled out his wooden trunk and opened it. From the false bottom, he carefully lifted a small wooden panel. Geri and Poggi stared at Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of Lisa Gherardini. Poggi examined the painting carefully. He checked for Leonardo's characteristic techniques. He studied the brushwork. He looked at the wood panel. It appeared authentic, but Poggi couldn't be certain without taking it back to the Uffizi for more thorough examination. He told Perugia they would need to keep the painting for safekeeping while they arranged for his reward. They would store it securely at the Uffizi and contact him within a few days. Perugia agreed. He seemed delighted that his plan was working. He handed over the Mona Lisa and returned to his hotel room to wait for his reward. Jerry and Poggi immediately transported the painting to the Uffizi Gallery. There, experts confirmed beyond doubt that this was the original Mona Lisa that had disappeared from the Louvre in August of 1911. The two men then contacted Italian police. Officers rushed to Perugia's hotel and arrested him. Perugia was genuinely shocked by his arrest. According to police reports and court documents, he insisted he had done nothing wrong. He had returned stolen Italian property to Italy. He expected to be treated as a hero, not a criminal. His patriotic defense would dominate his trial, even though the historical facts completely contradicted his claims. Napoleon had not stolen the Mona Lisa. The painting had been in France legally for 4 centuries. But Perugia's sincere belief in his false narrative convinced many Italians that his heart had been in the right place, even if his history was catastrophically wrong. News of the painting's recovery exploded across international media. The Mona Lisa had been found. His art, after more than 2 years, Leonardo's masterpiece would be returned to France. But first, Italy claimed its moment of glory. The painting went on display at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. 30,000 people viewed it in just the first 4 hours. The crowds were so massive that riots broke out among those who couldn't get inside. Police had to establish order as thousands of Italians pressed forward, desperate to see the painting that one of their countrymen had temporarily brought home. After the Florence exhibition, the Mona Lisa traveled to other Italian cities for brief displays. The tour allowed hundreds of thousands of Italians to view a painting that many of them believed should have been theirs all along, even though the historical record proved otherwise. The Italian government eventually agreed to return the painting to France, but the tour demonstrated the painting's new status. It was no longer simply an admired Renaissance portrait. It had become a cultural phenomenon. On January 4, 1914, the Mona Lisa returned to the Louvre. The French welcomed it with celebrations. More than 100,000 people visited the museum in just the first 2 days to see the recovered masterpiece. The crowds waiting to view the painting stretched around the block. Police had to manage the masses of people trying to get inside. The painting that had been moderately popular before its theft had become the most famous artwork in the world. Vincenzo Perugia stood trial in Florence in June of 1914. His defense lawyers argued that he had acted from patriotic motives. They portrayed him as a simple workman who believed he was serving his country by returning stolen property. Prosecutors presented evidence that Perugia had planned to sell the painting to art dealers for profit, which somewhat undermined his patriotic narrative. The prosecution showed that Perugia had contacted dealers using a false name and had specifically requested 500,000 lire as payment. Despite the evidence of profit motive, many Italians sympathized with Perugia. The fact that he had been factually wrong about the painting's provenance didn't matter to those who saw him as defending Italian cultural heritage. The court granted him extenuating circumstances. He was sentenced to 1 year and 15 days in prison. On appeal, his sentence was reduced to just 7 months. He served that brief term and was released. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through one of history's most incredible art heists. This channel is dedicated to bringing you compelling true crime stories that shaped our world every single week. Cases that captivated nations, mysteries that transformed how we think about crime and justice, and human stories behind the headlines. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Next week, we're diving into another case that gripped the world with its audacity and unexpected twists. But this story isn't quite over yet. There's one final chapter about what happened after the Mona Lisa came home. The theft transformed more than just the painting's fame. It changed how the world thought about art security. Museums across Europe and America immediately upgraded their protection systems. Paintings were bolted to walls, guard forces were expanded, cataloging systems were improved. The era of casual museum security ended because a 5'3" Italian handyman had simply walked out the front door with history's most famous portrait. The Mona Lisa never left France again for decades. When it finally did travel for special exhibitions in the 1960s, it was treated like visiting royalty. In 1963, Jacqueline Kennedy helped arrange for the painting to be displayed at the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The painting was welcomed with an official White House dinner. More than 1.7 million Americans viewed it during its 6-week stay. A similar tour to Japan in the 1970s drew comparable crowds. Today, the painting is considered too fragile and too valuable to ever leave the Louvre again. Modern visitors to the Louvre encounter the Mona Lisa displayed in the museum's largest room, the Salle des États, enclosed in bulletproof glass with climate controls maintaining perfect temperature and humidity. Guards monitor the painting constantly. Roughly 10 million people visit the Louvre each year, and an estimated 80% come primarily to see the Mona Lisa. They wait in lines, jostle for position behind protective barriers, and spend an average of 15 seconds actually viewing the painting before being pushed forward by the crowd behind them. The painting measures just 21 inches by 30 inches. It's remarkably small, given its enormous cultural footprint. Lisa Gherardini's enigmatic expression has been analyzed, copied, parodied, and reproduced billions of times. The Mona Lisa appears in advertisements, cartoons, music videos, and protest art. Andy Warhol screen-printed her. Salvador Dali added himself to the composition wearing a mustache. Marcel Duchamp drew a mustache and goatee on a reproduction in 1919. The painting has become shorthand for the concept of art itself. All of this fame, all of this cultural impact, stems directly from Vincenzo Peruggia's theft in 1911. Art historians largely agree that if the Mona Lisa had never been stolen, it would remain an admired Renaissance masterwork, but not the most famous painting in human history. The theft created the mystique. The 2 years of newspaper coverage introduced the painting to millions who had never heard of it. The dramatic recovery and trial cemented its status as a cultural icon. What happened to the people involved tells its own story. Peruggia served his 7-month sentence and returned to ordinary life. He fought in the Italian army during World War I and was captured by Austria-Hungary, spending 2 years as a prisoner of war. After the war ended, he married a woman named Annunziata Rossi and had a daughter. He returned to France and worked as a painter and decorator, using his birth name Pietro Peruggia rather than Vincenzo. He died on his 44th birthday, October 8, 1925, from a heart attack in a Paris suburb. His death was barely reported at the time because he died under his real name, and most people had forgotten about the Mona Lisa thief. Pablo Picasso and Guillaume Apollinaire repaired their friendship after the courtroom betrayal. The 2 Iberian statues that had inspired Les Demoiselles d'Avignon returned to the Louvre, where they remain in the collection today. Picasso went on to become the most influential artist of the 20th century. His brief arrest and interrogation over the Mona Lisa theft became a footnote in his biography. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the painting directly inspired by stolen Louvre artifacts, is considered the first major work of Cubism and one of the most important paintings in modern art history. It hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Apollinaire died in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic, 4 years after the Mona Lisa's return. He was just 38 years old. He had spent the years between his arrest and his death revolutionizing poetry and championing avant-garde art. He coined the term Cubism and helped establish the movement that would dominate early 20th century art. His brief imprisonment over stolen Iberian sculptures became another footnote in a remarkable life. Théophile Homola, The Louvre director who had declared the museum impregnable was forced to resign in disgrace. His successor implemented the security reforms that transformed museum protection worldwide. The Louvre's lax security procedures that had allowed Honoré Joseph Géripieri to repeatedly steal small objects and Vincenzo Peruggia to simply walk out with the Mona Lisa would never be possible again. So, what do you think? Did the theft ultimately serve art history by transforming the Mona Lisa into a cultural icon that brought millions of people into museums? Or did Peruggia's crime represent a near-catastrophic loss that the world was lucky to recover from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives on how crimes like this reshape culture and history. The theft of the Mona Lisa was never a sophisticated heist executed by a criminal mastermind. It was a simple theft enabled by inadequate security and carried out by a delusional handyman who fundamentally misunderstood history. Vincenzo Peruggia believed he was righting Napoleon's wrongs and returning stolen Italian property to its homeland. He was factually wrong about every aspect of his justification. Yet his crime transformed an admired Renaissance portrait into the most famous painting in human history. Every person who has waited in line at the Louvre to glimpse Lisa Gherardini's enigmatic smile owes that experience to a 5'3" Italian immigrant who kept the painting hidden under his bed for 2 years and truly believed he was doing the right thing. The fingerprint he left on the protective glass identified him conclusively. The investigators who twice interviewed him and dismissed him as too insignificant to be a serious suspect made one of the greatest oversights in criminal investigation history. The plumber who unlocked the door and let him walk out carrying Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece never knew what he had enabled. The painting that had belonged to French kings and hung in the Louvre since 1797 vanished into a Paris apartment and emerged 2 years later as the most recognizable image in art history. That transformation happened not despite the theft, but because of it.